So let's just say Palestine never existed, which is an absurdity. And if people want to say, well, it never existed as a state, they don't know history, because if you want, if it needs to be a state with a ruler over it and things like this, and bureaucracy, the taxes, the land, um, well, that existed during the Byzantine period, and it was Christian. Um, Not to mention who has been tending to the Church of Bethlehem, Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and all of these ancient churches for almost 2,000 years. Those people don't exist, and they didn't have a culture of their own. Let's say somebody conquers, let's say the Swedes invade the Yucatan Peninsula and build a wall. Or the Swedes invade and take half of Louisiana and call it, well, just Cajun country, let's say, which it's referred to, commonly. There was no place called Cajun country here, but that's not even a parallel, because there were still a place called Palestine. But the Yucatan, let's say the Swedes come down and take the Yucatan. There was no state of Yucatan here. No, but the land clearly belongs to Mexico. Well, they can go anywhere. They're Latin Americans. They have all these countries they could go to. No, but those people down there have a specific culture. It's not universal to Mexico. It's their land, and it's been in their family for generations. And some of their ancestors go back into prehistory. No, but there was never a state of the Yucatan. Well, it doesn't matter. It's not Swedish land. But the idea of of so-called Zionism, which was prohibited by the Jews for ever since at least the time of Bar Kokhba. No Jew today, and the only Jews that are left are the Karaites, and those descended from the Pharisees, known as the rabbinical tradition. So you have rabbinical Jews with their synagogues, and you have Karaites. That's it. And the Jews say we were expelled from the land. We're not allowed to rebuild the temple until the Messiah comes. And when God expels us from the land, we can't go back there. Let's say during the Babylonian captivity, some Jews escaped and took over the land. Would that be Israel? No. Actually, Israel has never been a land. It's a people. It's a holy nation. It's not a land. The land, actually, even in the Bible, even in the Torah, was called Canaan. And it was the entire Sinai, and it stretched up to the Euphrates. Now, because of where it was located, and that state never existed. That, if you're talking about ancient years, that never existed. There were tribal societies that claimed land, that invaded, that took land from the indigenous Canaanite, and these were people who admittedly were descended from a man from southern Iraq from Ur, whose child and grandchildren, great-grandchild, lived in the land, and then, boom, they were in Egypt for 400 years. So they're not indigenous to the land at all. And 400 years later, they come in and start wiping out people with genocide, but they can't get these Philistines out of the land. They never controlled all the land. It was a split between Judah and Israel. The Israelites in the north, the Judeans in the south. Then you have Sennacherib and Nebuchadnezzar come in. And then you have the Jews coming back, and they held Judah. And the Israelites had Samaria and the Galilee. And there was also, then after the Hasmonean period, you had the Roman conquest, and, because I'm going to skip over the Alexander the Great thing. Then you had Decapolis, which is part of Jordan, the Galilee, Samaria, and Judea. But we know that there was a state called Palestine. There was and it came from the Romans were so pissed after the Bar Kokhba revolt that in 135 they renamed it Palestine after the ancient enemy of the Jews. But the people living there, there was a kind of a show of expulsion of Jews, but the Jews had returned. Many of them had already converted to Christianity and were living in places like Bethlehem and Jerusalem and Nazareth, and had been living there from then until modern times. Meanwhile, there was a Jewish state at one point. It's called Khazaria, which is where 95% of the world's Jews come from, because Judaism was a very proselytizing religion. Admittedly, the Jews say, yeah, we proselytized for 600 years, and actually there was a lot of forced conversions. So these aren't descendants of Abraham. The vast majority of Jews are not Semitic. They're not Semites. However, the Palestinians, the Christians of the land of Palestine, the Jordanians, the Syrians, the Arabs, they're all Semites. So, National Socialists come in after World War II and set up a state. It's based as a communist state, but it's set up along the lines of what they perceive as race, or they consider themselves a race, even though they're from Ethiopia and Sweden and Poland and Germany, and the vast amount of them are descended from the Slavs and don't have a drop of Semitic blood in them. They come in and they kick the descendants of Abraham and David and the ancient Jews who converted to Christianity. They start kicking them out and murdering them, and they say, this is our land. Yeah, but you don't have any you have no link with the land. In fact, your form of Judaism that grew up in Lithuania and is only 300 years old. And you're not just reading the Tanakh, you're superseding it with the Talmud and all this other stuff, and Midrash and Mishnah and all this kind of stuff. The exact stuff that Christ spoke against, and you were expelled from the land. But to say Palestine never existed, yes, it did. Learn history. During the 6th century, Palestine was there, governing itself. It was under the Ottoman Empire, or it was under the Byzantine Empire, But that's just like saying Italy never existed because it's part of the Roman Empire. A lot of the modern states, their boundaries are messed up because of World War One and Two. Well, colonialism and World Wars One and Two. Are you against Northern Ireland? Do you think Ireland should be united? And this is to what, Steven Doering? Yeah, Steven Doering. So it's mighty absurd. And people say, well, the Arabs can go everywhere. They have 26 countries or whatever. Well, there's Arabe, but the people of Palestine, the people between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, are distinct people. Many particular forms of Christianity. There's the Samaritans there, which are direct descendants. They are the descendants of Israel. They're the blood descendants of Israel. That are not Christian, but the majority of the blood descendants of Israel were Christians, in places like Bethlehem and Nazareth and stuff like that. And the idea that Slavs that converted to Judaism in the 10th century, that migrated to Lithuania, say that's our land, is ridiculous. I mean, how do you square that? I'm wondering, Steven Doering, how I mean, what type of sense does that make? If let's say a bunch of Germans convert to Buddhism, and say that they're the real Tibetan Buddhists, and declare the Dalai Lama and the rest of Tibetan Buddhism apostate, should they rush in and destroy the culture there and expel everyone and call themselves real Tibet, even though Tibet has never been a separate nation from China, or at least not since for well over 1,000 years. Tibet wasn't a separate nation, or at least the borders of what is now called Tibet was never separate from China. I mean, how do you square all this? You should think for yourself, research, and read some history books, and just don't go online and looking at websites. Crack open some books and look at the atrocities that are being done against the Christians. There's no Christians in Palestine or Israel that is for the modern Zionist state. None. There are none.